addressing them as we go along. So I think those are the main things from us today. So I'll hand this over to you now, Zara, and thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Natasha. That's lovely. And it's really lovely to see all of you here today. And I'm sure you're all really looking forward to Professor Ianthi Tsimpli's lecture on learner diversity, a challenge for learner assessment. So I promise not to keep you too long. I just wanted to give you a little overview of who we are and a little bit about the Masters of Studies in English Language Assessment. So we are the University of Cambridge, which, as you're probably aware, is an 800-year-old global institution with a really rich history of innovation and leadership in a range of subjects. One of the most important parts of the university's mission, though, is to share its research with the world globally. And within the university, at the Institute of Continuing Education, our mission really is to make that research and the teaching of the university accessible to all, as accessible as possible. I mean, that started around 150 years ago, in about 1868, with our founder, James Stewart, who took a very active approach and took the teaching of the university into industrial cities in the UK. But nowadays, we're still doing that, and we design, deliver and curate a portfolio of short courses and award-bearing undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications. We're also the admitting and awarding body for MSTs, which is Master of Studies, which is a part-time master's course in the University of Cambridge. So that's us. Why English language assessment? Well, I'm sure many of you are here today because you're aware that there is an expanding need for English language assessment globally. And it's becoming ever more important to share the latest technologies and the best practice. And at Cambridge, we're in the fortunate position to be really at that cutting edge of research and experience in the field. The course itself is aimed at English language teachers, educational practitioners, and other professionals who are seeking to enhance and consolidate their knowledge in English language assessment. Now, in adult education, it's often the peer-to-peer networking and the sharing of experience that really brings a course to life. And in this course, we anticipate a global cohort, which we can see in the chat, actually, so that's lovely, but sharing different perspectives and experiences and gaining a really first-hand understanding of the challenges of language assessment in different contexts and cultures. So I've spoken a little bit about ICE, the Institute of Continuing Education, and why we are interested in offering the MST in English language assessment. But this is a really exciting course because it's a partnership course within the university, and it's delivered jointly by Cambridge Language Sciences Interdisciplinary Research Centre, hereafter known as IRC, and by Cambridge Assessment English. There's also input from the Institute of Automated Language Teaching and Assessment, or ALTA, and the whole course offers a unique combination of cross-disciplinary expertise. So just looking at those partners, we'll start with Cambridge Assessment, which I'm sure probably needs not much introduction to many of you, but it's a world leader in assessment in educational contexts. And Cambridge Assessment English, which is a group within the wider Cambridge Assessment, is the global leader in English language assessment. And to put that in context, that means it provides exams in English for speakers of other languages taken by over 5 million candidates every year worldwide. And it also runs a leading range of qualifications for language teachers. So Cambridge Assessment uses cutting-edge educational technology based on the use of digital data and devices for language education. And as part of the MST, some of the teaching is likely to be based at their global headquarters, which is in the Triangle at Cambridge. So the IRC, as the name implies, is interdisciplinary. And Cambridge Language Sciences is actually a virtual research centre at the university, set up in 2011 and based within the Department of Theoretical and Applied Linguistics. Its mission is to bring together language researchers from different academic disciplines to develop new collaborations. And it's worth noting that whilst on the MST, students will be able to have a profile on that language sciences website and be a really visible and active part of the wider research community. Interdisciplinarity is something you'll hear again and again. So this approach has informed the development of the MST, which will itself offer excellent theoretical and empirical research in a broad spread of fields, from historical linguistics and comparative syntax to language processing and computational linguistics. So this brings me nicely onto my introduction, Professor Ianthi Tsimpli, because Cambridge routinely tops national university league tables for linguistics, and staff include researchers considered world experts in their fields, of which Professor Tsimpli is one. Professor Ianthi Tsimpli is a chair of English and Applied Linguistics in the Department of Theoretical and Applied Linguistics, which is part of the School of Modern and Medieval Languages. And she was formerly the co-chair of the IRC. She's a fellow of Fitzwilliam College, and prior to working at Cambridge, Professor Tsimpli taught linguistics at University College London, the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, the University of Reading, and the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, where she founded and directed the Language Development Lab. Her research areas of interest are bilingualism and multilingualism, first and second language acquisition, psycholinguistics, and language impairment. And in the last 10 years, she's been working on the factors that could explain variation among bilingual and multilingual learners, focusing on the role of language of education on the cognitive and linguistic development of learners from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. So without further ado, I shall stop talking and hand over to Professor Ianthi Tsimpli. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zara. Can you all hear me okay? I'll just begin, assuming that you can all hear me. I can't see many of you, actually, but in fact, I can't see anybody, but I will try to be as comprehensive as I can in this talk. It will last a bit longer than 25 minutes, I'm afraid, but I will try to be as within this time limit as I can. So as Zara said, I'm going to talk about learner diversity, which is a challenge for language assessment. And this will give you an idea of some of the topics in the modules that we will be teaching and sharing with you in the new MST in English Language Assessment. Okay, so I'll just give you a roadmap in the first instance of what is measured in language assessment, usually and typically. I'll give you some background on L1 and L2 assessment and some differences and similarities. Then I will move on to the actual topic, which is the challenge of learner diversity, and I will present 2 case studies there. Then I will propose, following the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, that teaching, learning, and assessment need to be considered in an integrated way rather than as separate components. And finally, I'll talk very briefly about a new type of assessment, which is dynamic assessment. It's a way forward, and it actually adopts the idea of integrating teaching, learning, and assessment. So language assessment measures learner skills in speaking, listening, reading, and writing, as we, I think, probably all know. So these are the 4 modalities, the 4 types of skills that are measured. But in order for the learner to perform well or at the level that they can in any of these skills, they need to draw on knowledge which comes from various domains of language. Okay, so vocabulary knowledge, grammar and syntax, morphology, that is how words inflect, what sort of endings they take depending on the context in which they appear, the meaning of words and sentences, as well as the use in semantics, and as well as the use of language in different contexts in pragmatics. So although there are general principles underlying pragmatic use of language, each language has its own, let's say, pragmatic idiosyncrasies, which learners need to learn. So all of these components are integrated in performance in each of the 4 skills, speaking, listening, reading, and writing. But is there a priority order among these 4 skills? Now, when we look at the first language assessment, speaking and understanding usually precede, as we know, reading and writing, because children go to school later, not from birth. And that has to do with cognitive maturity, but it also has to do with the fact that there are linguistic reasons underlying both reading and writing competences, as well as speaking and understanding. And for example, these are phonological skills that are prerequisites for both, let's say, reading and understanding and speaking a language. The other type of distinction between the four modalities is that speaking and writing are both production modalities, while listening and reading are comprehension modalities. And typically we have a priority ordering between comprehension and production, so that comprehension precedes production, as is usually the case. When assessing a first language, we always tend to look at oral abilities first, because they take priority in development, also in assessment, particularly when a learner, a child, let's say, is at risk of language impairment or experiences some language delay. So oral abilities take precedence over reading and writing. But when we turn to second and foreign language skills, what we see is that oral and written language often develops in parallel in second language acquisition, particularly when this is in instructed context, like, for example, in a school context, in university, in after-school clubs, and so on. Now, it is also commonly the case that written language, that is reading and writing skills, are better in second language learners, especially from instructed context, than oral skills. And it's also the case that second language learners of English, for example, are better at formal academic use of language. So more the formal register is more familiar to them than the colloquial register. And that is primarily because of reduced oral input in the classroom. So not as much as if you had English in a society where English is the majority language, and over-reliance on textbooks and written material. So before I turn to some cases where English is used in instructed context and look at diversity of learners, let me just ask first the question of what if you use English as a second language in an English-speaking country, for example, the UK? So as you can see from this graph, which is from government statistics, the number of bilingual children in English schools, that is children who have another first language, and English is an additional language, these are EAL children, as we call them, has increased a lot, and this graph goes up to 2013. Unfortunately, but I can say that the increase is still continuing. So we have over 1 million EAL children in UK schools. Now, when you have English as an additional language, you are still expected to be assessed with the same tests as children who have English as a first language, and I call them EF children here. And this is true both for any assessment that they take in schools, but also any standardized assessment tools for language ability. So when we test children, both EAL and EF children, on vocabulary, knowledge, grammar, on their ability to tell stories and to be coherent in their stories, as well as the reading skills, we use the same assessment tools. Now, the question is this appropriate and is it fair? It is well known in the research that has been conducted using standardized assessment tools that there is a risk of misdiagnosis of language impairment in children assessed in the second language. And when I say misdiagnosis, I mean overdiagnosis. They diagnose language impairment when there isn't one, or they miss the diagnosis of language impairment because they attribute language problems to bilingualism. When you, if you look at this graph, what you can see is that that's also from government statistics. You can look at a comparison between children with English as a first language and EAL children, and you can look at them in the various key stages at school. And what is assessed is reading and maths, as well as the overall level of development. So you can see that children at age 5, 7, 11, 16 are assessed in both reading and maths, and you can see that there is a gap in development between EF children and EAL children. That gap seems to close, and it actually closes completely when children reach the age of 16. And there is this closing of gap happening throughout these years. But these years are a lot, and in fact cover all of compulsory education. Now, one thing that we need to consider is whether the closing of this gap could actually be done earlier in assessment, and whether assessing all the children with the same tools may actually miss out on the learning abilities and potential that EAL children have. Now, one thing we need to keep in mind is that language mediates every school subject. So it's not just English language where there is a problem. If English is the second language for a child educated in the UK, then the effect of language proficiency in English would perhaps turn up in every one of the school subjects that the child is assessed in. So EAL children have to progress not only in the content of school subjects in the curriculum, but also in their second language, English. And of course, catching up in the end means it's feasible to catch up. But the question is whether the process until then is a fair representation of EAL children's potential compared to EF children. So what that case study tells us is that we need to focus on the learner. When we think of assessment tools, we need to consider who it is we need to assess. And you know that here in Cambridge, as Zara mentioned, but also in other organizations, there are many tools that have been used, specific assessment tools that are used for placing learners to a proficiency level, for example, for classroom allocation, or tools for certifying proficiency in English skills. Usually, it is the case that these proficiency tests do not exactly link learning with assessment. They just look at the end result. And they also ignore the first language of the learner, both in the process of learning and in assessment. Now, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, in fact, the recent companion volume that was published in 2020, asks us to think a bit differently about teaching, learning, and assessment. And it prioritizes the role of the learner, looking at the learner as being a social agent who directs, commands, and has full command of their own process of learning, as well as self-assessment. So syllabuses are supposed to be based on needs analysis, and they should be oriented towards real-life tasks, as well as communication. And when we assess proficiency, we should be focusing on what learners can do, rather than whatever deficiency they seem to have in things they cannot do as yet in the second language. In this respect, we look at Seffer's descriptive scheme and the structure, and I'm not going to go through that. You can find it online, it's freely available. But when it characterizes overall language proficiency, it is looking at, for example, language activities and language strategies. And in here, you can find reception and production, that is, both in written and oral language, which are accompanied by interaction and mediation. So what is supposed to be essential for learning a second language and being assessed in the second language is interaction, so encouraging interaction between learners so that they can practice the second language and develop it in this way, but also allow learners to use mediation strategies, where mediation means translation or interpretation, paraphrasing, but also crucially and very importantly, using their first language to support the message they want to convey if their proficiency is not at the appropriate level as yet. So the question is, how is mediation assessment, how would they work naturally in a class? And keeping in mind that we're looking at learners of English around the world in diverse contexts. So the challenge that comes with learner diversity, and the question that I would like you to think about, is whether it is possible, whether it is fair, and whether it is feasible to use the same assessment tool with learners who come from diverse backgrounds. And when I talk about backgrounds, I mean different first languages, different lingualism status, whether they are monolingual, bilingual, or multilingual already, and English is the third or the fourth language that they're learning, different education systems, different ages, different socioeconomic status, but also differences between whether they come from the global north or the global south. And this is related to socioeconomic status, but it is also very importantly related to the fact that very many societies in the global south and very many countries are highly linguistically diverse. they're multilingual, okay? So one of these countries is India, and it is one of the prototypically, let's say, linguistically diverse countries. It has 22 scheduled languages, that is 22 languages that are recognized officially as possible mediums of instruction in schools. And there are, on top of that, 462 languages that are spoken. And in fact, that is a rather conservative estimation. If you ask linguists, other linguists, they will say that taking into account varieties of these languages, you go up to 1,000 different languages. So you can understand that there is a challenge there in developing language, academic language and language ability. Now, the role of English in India, as you probably know, is that it is a very, well, controversial, but also primarily the role it has is that it's a language of power, and it's a way in which somebody can improve their socioeconomic position. This has been heard, let's say, listened to by different states in India, and they have changed a lot of government schools, a lot of state schools, into English medium schools. But even if it's not an English medium school, English in India is taught as a subject in all schools as early as year 3 or even year 1. And of course, English is everywhere in media channels, in the society, and in government documents. So it has a very powerful place. In the last 4 years, I directed a large research project in India, where, among other things, we assessed literacy skills in English as a second language, but we also assessed literacy in the regional language of the same children. And what we did is we tested their reading skills using a test which is developed by a very large NGO focusing on education, has been used with hundreds of thousands of children in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and many other countries. And it tests basic literacy. So these children were assessed in both English literacy, and you see some examples here. So they have to recognize letters, they have to read words, paragraphs, and stories, and then they have to answer a couple of comprehension questions on the story which we developed. Now, looking at diversity, in this particular study, we have 1,272 children from across India, from Delhi, Patna, and Hyderabad, and they all come from disadvantaged backgrounds, so from low socioeconomic status. They're all in the same class in the year 4, okay? But you can actually see diversity even when you're just looking at their ages. So you can see that in the same class, there will be children who are 8 years old and 12 years old, 7 or 15, and so on. And we also looked at whether the children came from a monolingual household or a multilingual household. Everybody, as an adult in India, on average, they speak 3 to 4 different languages. But what we focused on was basically whether the household in which they grow up has more than one language. And you find, as you can see here, that in all 3 sites, we have a good number of bilingual and multilingual children. Some of them, 265 children in this group, were minority language speakers, so they speak a language that is not supported in school. So we had in total 28 different languages spoken by our learners. So this is what I mean by diversity, at least from the perspective of first language. When we tested them on literacy, what we saw was that if you look at English literacy and you look at each of the components of the literacy test, letters, words, paragraphs, story, and comprehension in English, you can see that even if children were going to English medium schools, the performance actually declined with the difficulty, which is expected, right? I mean, it's easier to recognize words and to recognize letters and read words, paragraphs, stories, and so on. Comprehension is the ultimate aim of reading. And what we found here is that comprehension, even by children who go to an English medium school, is rather poor, okay? So, and if you compare this performance with literacy in Hindi, which is, you know, a national language and also a regional language in Delhi and Patna, you can see that regardless of whether children were going to an English medium school or a Hindi medium school, they perform much better than they do in English. And the question is, why doesn't medium of instruction make a difference? What are we missing here when we are assessing these children? Well, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that in order to learn a language and perform well in assessment, you need to have good quantity and quality of input in that language. So when we looked at English medium schools in Delhi and Hyderabad, and we tried to see whether English is the language in which the lessons were delivered in these schools, what we found actually is that in Delhi, English medium schools, there was no plain English used at all, okay, no English on its own. What was used was almost a quarter of the time, it was Hindi, and 77% of the time, it was a language, Hindi, that was mixed with English. So children were presented with English in this context. If you turn to Hyderabad schools that have English medium as well, that are English medium instruction schools, what you see is a different picture. We do have English used on its own in the class by the teacher, but we also have language mixing. We also have the regional language, which is Telugu. Okay, so what we see is that these children all go to English medium schools, but the input they receive is different. The textbooks are similar, okay? They are English textbooks, they are similar, and they are assessed in similar tasks. The question is it fair to assess them in similar tasks, ignoring the fact that the input they receive in English is so different? But before I leave this case study, I summarize, I just want to say that the multilingual children we had in our group actually were better than the monolingual children in all aspects of reading development. So being monolingual actually does not give you an advantage in second language learning. Being multilingual gives you an advantage in learning a new language, in this case, English. So the question is how to approach learner diversity. How can we approach it? Well, Seifert tells us, and I think they're right, that we need to bring together teaching, learning, and assessment, and we need to focus on the learner and the diversity that we observe in the learners. We also need to allow for skills that children have already, and learners, adults, have already developed in their first language and other languages to be used for building knowledge in a new language. So we shouldn't separate the languages like that. And this is exactly the spirit of the notion of plurilingualism, which is what the Council of Europe is promoting, so that languages are interrelated and interconnected. Language and cultures are not kept in separated mental compartments in the individual. Knowledge and experience contribute, all aspects of language knowledge and experience can contribute to building up communicative competence. And learning new languages does not have as a goal mastery at the level of a native speaker of that language, because that's usually not possible. But what we need is mastery of skills that would be enough, sufficient, and necessary for communication to happen in the appropriate context and social conditions. Most importantly, barriers between languages can be overcome in communication. And this important message is that different languages can be used purposefully for conveying messages in the same situation. That brings back the notion of mediation and how the first language can actually support teaching, learning, but also assessment of the second language. So finally, I just want to mention one type of assessment that has been developing in the last 10 years and is gaining ground, which is dynamic assessment. Dynamic assessment is actually not looking just at the goal and the end result of learning, but it looks at the potential for learning a language in a learner. So it focuses on the learner. Dynamic assessment has already been shown to be a valid approach to assessment for children who are bilingual already, or they come from different cultural backgrounds, they're disadvantaged or have educational or clinical needs. And it is in that sense particularly promising for low socioeconomic status learners and minority language speakers learning English as a foreign language. Because in these cases, the environment of these learners might not have enabled them to reach the full potential that they already have cognitively, but it has not surfaced as well. So they are therefore likely to benefit from intervention. Intervention is teaching. So the method in dynamic assessment is a 3-step one, so test, teach, test. And that means that you have a first stage where you establish the level of independent performance of the learner. In the second stage, you intervene and you support the learner to learn things that they find difficult, and then you retest to assess the degree to which this intervention has helped. So dynamic assessment is meant not to replace standard assessment, but to complement standard assessments. And it helps learners notice the aspects of language that may cause them difficulty, and to prompt them to use cues or strategies to overcome this difficulty. So to conclude, what learner diversity requires, hopefully I've shown today, is flexibility from the point of view of the teacher and the assessor, sensitivity to the role of the learner's environment and background, and also crucially, this idea of integrating teaching, learning, and assessment as one desirable. So I will stop here. This is some information on the course page and the email for inquiries. And thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Ianthi. That's lovely. That's really interesting. And we do have a couple of questions. So the first one, I think, is a fairly straightforward, but just to kind of clarify, what exactly is meant by an English medium school or English medium instruction? Does it mean that all instructions in English or not?
Yes. So English medium school means that it's a school where English is the language which is used for teaching, for assessment, and the language of the textbooks. So an English medium school is a school that has all textbooks in English, all classes are in English, regardless of content, and all assessment is in English.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. That's really clear. So then I have a question. If EAL, so English as an additional language learners, were given different assessment from the other children, could that potentially be labelled as discriminatory?
Sorry?
Just as discrimination. I mean, does it discriminate too much between the children?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that the problem with assessing EAL and EF children in using the same tools may be overcome if there is a weighting that we can use in grading the children. So taking into account language proficiency, language ability, when evaluating the content of the response. And I have to say that although teachers usually are aware of these differences between EAL and EF children, it is inevitable, and I think it's a matter of implicit bias that we have when we listen to somebody whose language is not as perfect as it should be, or whose writing skills are not, and academic writing is not as good as it should be. We are biased negatively, and that is an implicit bias that we have, even though we may be aware that this person is an EAL person.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, there's a question for you in terms of, are you bi or multilingual yourself with English, and is English your second or additional language? And following on from that, if so, have you experienced what you might consider to be difficulties in the process of learning English or not?
Well, my first language is Greek, and I have to say that English was a foreign language for me throughout the time that I was in Greece and I was educated there. Well, as you can guess, I mean, my English is quite fluent now, but you know, that was a gradual process, and it helps because I live in the country, so it always helps. Did I have any difficulties? Yeah, obviously. I mean, there are many difficulties, and there are still words and idiomatic expressions that I ask colleagues to either explain or use or teach me, so that I can improve my English. But the process of language development or language learning never stops. And in fact, it never stops for your first language either. I mean, there's no person in this world that can say, I've reached the end of what I can learn about my first language. So I think we are all in this process.
Absolutely. There's actually, and we've got a so true from one of our participants as well, agreeing with you there. But there's actually kind of a suggestion or a proposal. What about free voluntary reading as proposed by Stephen Krashen?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with EAL children, but also English as a second language in learners around the world, is the development of reading comprehension, right? So writing obviously is also difficult, but in terms of these receptive skills, we always seem to find problems with second language learners, both in oral comprehension, but also in reading comprehension. And the question is, why? I mean, they may be very good readers in their first language. What is it that stops them? And they may actually have very good proficiency in English as well, and still their comprehension is slower, okay, or less accurate. So the usual suggestion, and this is, I think, true also for monolingual children who are struggling with reading, because it's not just the bilinguals that are struggling with reading, there are many monolinguals that are struggling with reading, is to read more. So the answer to improving, your reading ability is indeed to read more and read what you like, but have exposure to language in the written form in any way that is suitable. And of course, when it comes to children, we need to control what they're reading. But when it comes to adults, any type of reading, and of course, the more complex, more academic reading is more demanding cognitively. But I think voluntary reading is indeed an answer to, or a way to address the problems with reading comprehension. So reading difficulties always should be addressed with an attempt to do more reading, perhaps through also dynamic assessment, some intervention. So people who would help you, address the areas in reading which are more difficult for you.
And that actually brings us really nicely. I've got a couple of questions about dynamic assessment. So the first is how might you use dynamic assessment in an EFL context? And then also, at what point or points would dynamic assessment be delivered in an ideal world?
Yeah, so typically one of the aims of dynamic assessment is to find out, so if you have a class and you see of EFL learners, and you realize that some of them are struggling with programming, they're not making the progress that you expect or that other children or adults in this class are making, is to have a one-to-one dynamic assessment mode, let's say, where you could identify the problem, where the problem is. One of the interesting things about dynamic assessment is that when you actually use dynamic assessment with learners, you can, at the end, at the final testing phase, if there is no change because of the intervention, if there's no change found, then you realize that the problem that this learner has is a more, let's say, it's a different type of problem. It's a problem that might require, I don't know, a speech and language therapist to look at, and so on. Usually dynamic assessment with people that have, let's say, a neurotypical profile works well, and it actually makes second language and foreign language learners appreciate, notice the areas of difficulty in a text, prompt them with cues to address them, and eventually they will be able to transfer the skills that they have learned through that dynamic assessment to other texts that they're reading. And in fact, eventually, I think that we can hope that they will transfer the skills to other domains where language is used. So mathematics, for example, science, and so on.
Brilliant. So we've got a couple of different questions about education systems as well. So there's what is the impact of education systems broadly on English assessment? And can you give an example first? And then
yes, I mean, I can give you a very sort of example broadly. In Europe, generally, and in North America, it is typically the case that there is a lot of teacher-learner interaction going on in the classroom. And this is something that you observe, let's say, as a method that is also from nursery, from very early on in the children are asked to express their views, to think critically about claims, about events, about history, about all sorts of things. So they are pushed to actually express their opinion and their views. This is something that in many other countries is actually not the case. So there is no teacher-learner interaction in various contexts, particularly in some schools in India, in a lot of government schools in India. There is a very traditional way of teaching, which is very teacher-centric. So the teacher goes in the class, reads from the textbook, and whatever response there is from the children, it's not really to enhance, let's say, their critical thinking skills or to question anything that is in the textbook, but more as a choral repetition of what the teacher has said. So in that sense, that education system is not very open to the type of assessment that we offer, to measure English language proficiency, where you need to be asked to critically think about what you're presented with. You need to be able to process the instructions, which sometimes are quite complex. You need to have this training of critical thinking to be able to answer proficiency tests in English as a foreign language. And I think that's a disadvantage that is caused not by language proficiency, but by the educational system.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. And thinking about that and generally about IB schools, so where students are from all different backgrounds, how does that impact potentially?
Yeah, I think this is, it's really good. I mean, it is, when you look at these schools, I mean, typically, what you always have to keep in mind is that socioeconomic status plays an important role. And I think that socioeconomic status plays an important role, not on its own, but because it reflects, it's used as, let's say, an indication of how much language and literacy support there is from home. Okay, so one of the things that we have observed is that, children who go to English medium schools in India, for example, when they come from very disadvantaged backgrounds, what that translates into is that when they leave school, they have no exposure to English, they have no help with their homework, there isn't much literacy support, because many of them are what we call first-generation learners. That is, they are the only ones who know how to read in the household. Okay, so in that case, we have an issue that is affected by socioeconomic status. In IB schools, typically, we have middle class, let's say, students who do have support from home and who are likely to be supported in that context. What is positive, however, there is that the exchange of languages and identities and cultures and so on is actually very good for learning. And there are some schools that promote that as part of learning content, right? So they have a theme that they are discussing, and they invite students from different cultures and languages to contribute in that way. Is actually very positive.
Definitely. So thinking about using Language 1 and Language 2, there's a couple of questions. One is, would you recommend using Language 1 while teaching Language 2? And then the other question, which is sort of related, is there much difference between letting the children use their Language 1 in the class and not letting it be used at all?
Okay, so it depends on the proficiency of the learner. So, I mean, if you go into a beginner class, a real beginner class with no English, right? I mean, you have to use the first language, because children are not going to be able to understand it, or adults for that matter, they won't be able to understand. So the whole point about using the first language is to actually mediate the development of the second language. And it is a very interesting question for the teacher and the challenge for the teacher to strike a balance there, because obviously the better the language proficiency in the second language, the more likely the student will be independent enough to understand an English-only text or understand an English-only stretch of speech and so on. So I think it should be modulated by proficiency level, and it is a challenge for teachers. I mean, a challenge in the sense that they should be aware of what the learner is able to do with English only at a particular stage. However, I would say, and this is my own view, and I wouldn't generalize that this is in any case a received wisdom or anything like that. I would say that, we need to get away from the idea that the ultimate aim is to suppress the L1 completely, the first language completely, and just leave the L2. I think we know from people who have good knowledge of a first and a second language, or in fact more than two languages, that they can use them together and mixed. Okay, and there is a lot of code switching going on among bilinguals and multilinguals. And apparently these people can use them in a mixed way, but they can also separate them. If the listener doesn't share these two languages, they're not going to mix them, right? Because they will know that the listener is not going to follow. So I think that we should get the stigma out of this mixing of languages in class. And I think that even when proficiency improves, I think you're still allowed to use more than one language if that gets the message across, since you will be able to separate them when you're asked to.
Yeah, definitely. A couple of questions are requesting sort of recommendations. So there's one that's just in general to improve reading. Are there any sort of key books you recommend? And then in conjunction with that, are there any publicly available sort of free dynamic and adaptive sort of tests that you can use with students as well?
Well, actually, dynamic assessment doesn't have that method of proposing a particular, way of dealing with reading comprehension. It's still under development. I have to say that there are research articles that are quite accessible that have been used with adult foreign language learners. They were Spanish learners of English, and they were adults, and the dynamic assessment was used not at the one-to-one level, but at the group level. So they followed the test, teach, the intervention test again, and this was with the focus on vocabulary. So there are research articles. There isn't a method, I think, that is yet available for dynamic assessment. As for reading, I'm familiar with the research literature on reading. I wouldn't recommend any books now because I don't think I should. But it's fine if if people want to contact me by email. I'm happy to send some references.
Lovely, and we've got a generic. It's education@ice.cam.ac.uk, which I'll put in the chat as well, so you can ask any questions and we can forward them on for specific recommendations. So, thinking about dynamic assessment, you sort of just touched on it, whether it can be in a group setting or individual setting. So if you have large classes, is it possible to implement dynamic assessment?
Well, as I said, dynamic assessment is there to complement standard assessment. So you don't have to use it as a replacement. Dynamic assessment works best if you have it on a one-to-one basis, as far as I know from my experience. And you should perhaps think of using it when you have concerns about the progress that particular students in your class experience. So I don't think that it is something, it's usually one-to-one. It's not practical and feasible to do with a huge class, and that's why it doesn't aim to replace standard assessments. But if you can see that some of the learners are actually not progressing in the way that you expect them to, then it's a good idea to actually use it to find out where the problem is. Because as I said, if the intervention doesn't work, then the potential for learning may not be there in full, and therefore additional support is required.
That makes sense. And do you have any advice for learners who struggle with their dependency on mother tongue language, who then slow down their speaking speed and thinking process and word orders in the English language? Sorry, that's
Yeah, well, I think that, really the answer to this is there is so much individual variation, and we are all in a situation where sometimes our English as a second language or foreign language works better than other times. So when you're very tired, for example, or when you have a couple of glasses of wine, maybe, it doesn't work that well, or it works better. I mean, it could go both ways. But I think that input in that language, so reading more, I am a strong believer in written language for adults. So I think that the more you read in that second language, in that foreign language, the more consolidated your knowledge of the grammar and of whatever, areas of difficulty you have will be addressed, right? So, I mean, I think that more exposure to the language, and perhaps if you know what the problem is, it's always easier. I mean, you're halfway there if you know where the problem is.
Definitely. And thinking about kind of specifics of testing and courses. So I've got a question about whether the CELTA course is different from the TEFL course.
Right. Well, I'm afraid that to respond to.
No problem at all. So if in terms of that question, as I say, I'll put the education advice address in the chat, and we will get a bit more time to get back to you probably on that one. And
maybe my colleagues from Cambridge Assessment would be.
Yes, that's what I was just thinking. We can use the expertise more broadly. There's also a question in terms of difficulty in getting employed because of a lack of proficiency in English and kind of global competency, and does a similar problem occur in English speaking countries? So obviously this is a really broad question. I'm not expecting you to answer on behalf of all companies in the country, but just from your experience, whether you think there's perhaps a difference. So this is specifically in a Malaysian context, whether you think there's likely to be a difference in English speaking countries or non-English speaking countries.
So, well, I mean, interestingly, Malaysia is also, an English-speaking country in the sense that it is, English has a very prominent role there, the same way that English is very prominent in India or in South Africa. So I don't know whether English-speaking countries is the right...
Might not be the right term, yeah.
Yeah, plus the fact that all these countries have their own varieties of English that they use, which are not standard English in the traditional way of categorizing that. But unfortunately, I think regardless of whether you're in an English-speaking country or not, your level of proficiency in the language of English is a prerequisite for that job. Yeah, obviously, you're going to be judged on that as well. And I think depending on what the company's aims are and what your role in that company will be. So if you're in PR, in public relations and so on, then probably language will count most. If you are in the IT department, I'm not sure, So it's really a question that affects non-English speakers of English as a second language. And this has nothing to do with the country itself. It has to do with who you are and what the company is asking for.
I think that's a very comprehensive answer, really, on that one. So then there's a suggestion or kind of query whether it's a good suggestion is whether extended certification might be a good way to identify learners who might need more support in terms of summative assessment situations. Do you think that?
We talk about formative and summative assessment, but I think that indeed, going for a continuous assessment, you're more likely to identify problems in the progress of a learner rather than having just a final exam that is going to assess their knowledge of language and their ability to use it. So clearly, yes, I think continuous assessment is the answer to that.
So just a couple more questions, where we're sort of coming to time as well. But in terms of pursuing a career in English education, and I'm presuming this means instead of teaching English education, is it better to have a background in English or linguistics? And I'm not entirely clear whether it's English or linguistics compared to something else, or English or linguistics. But,
you can have English linguistics as well, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. So.
But yeah, I mean, they give you different, different types of skills and knowledge. Linguistics, well, I have a biased opinion here, but linguistics gives you a very good insight into what language is and what the different domains of language that might cause a problem to second language learning and acquisition might be. And you can identify them when you're presented with linguistic performance, linguistic behavior in your learners. Education background gives you more, let's say, general information about assessment, learning, and so on, which is also extremely important. Because it's not the case that every linguist can actually look at English language education. And it's not the case that every education expert can talk about English language learning and assessment, right? So I think that they give you different skills and different types of knowledge. Yeah, and I think both are very important.
Excellent. So then, so I think you've answered this a little bit already, but in terms of encouraging students to speak their second language confidently, I know you've mentioned reading as being really important in terms of comprehension and kind of fluency, but is there anything else that you can think of that really sticks out in terms of encouraging students to speak with confidence?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's very important to use the language, right? Orally, and I think that it's not a question of using the language only with native speakers of that language. That's the only practice. I think there is, peer group interaction is extremely important. So learners should be talking to learners, and they are learning. I mean, we know that learners can learn from other learners who are in a similar stage of proficiency or a different one. So I think that within CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Language, this idea of interaction was actually meant to be that you should be talking to other learners of English. And despite the fact that their English is also not native, you're going to learn from them. And in fact, you learn from, because it's the nature of communication and the demands on communication that will make you learn better.
Absolutely good. So I've just got Jill Grimshaw, thank you very much, has actually noted that CELT is a teacher training course aimed at teachers of English as a foreign additional or other language. So I will still respond if you email education@ice.cam.ac.uk, but thank you very much for putting that in there. And then I think the final question in that case is, have you got examples of DA, of dynamic assessment in practice? Any particular specific examples?
There are, as I said, there are research articles that have studies that have looked at and they report on the results of applying DA in foreign language class and with adults. The ones that I'm familiar with are with adults. And there are others with children, but in this case, the aim was to look at language because there was a clinical concern rather than, it wasn't an educational thing as such on its own. It was a question about special needs.
Thank you ever so much. I think we've come to the end of the questions in our Q&A. I'm just having a quick scan of the chat to make sure there's nothing there that I might have missed. Certainly in terms of the recording, as Natasha said at the beginning, we will be sharing the recording. It will probably be on the course page of our website in a couple of weeks' time. And thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and answering all the questions as well. I'll hand back to Tash now, I believe. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Ianthi. It's been wonderful to have you with us, and I think it's a very interesting subject. I think we've all got into some very long discussions about linguistics and understanding, and I'm, you know, as you highlighted before, I think this is an extremely important subject, and I think the way everyone's interacted today, I understand there's a lot of interest, so I really would encourage you to view our course page and find out a little bit more about the programme itself, and feel free to get in touch with us using the email address that Zara has shared. And I think that's it from me today. Today's, as you said, the webinar has been recorded. We will share this in a couple of weeks. And thank you again to everyone for joining us, both our lovely speakers and our wonderful attendees, for your very interesting and actually insightful and engaging questions. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy your day and afternoon. Thanks very much.